You know, a lot of people will say, well, it just seems so hard to believe the Bible because of all those miracles and everything. Well, the Big Bang's a miracle. Evolution of life would have to be a miracle. And the changing of that life into all the origin of the species all require violations of the laws of science. To believe there's no God, you're going to have to believe in miracles without a miracle maker. To believe that evolution is true, you're going to have to violate some of the main, most important principles and laws of science that have been agreed upon. Not only does the evolutionary atheist worldview violate the first law of thermodynamics, that's against a principle of science, but also Louis Pasteur proved spontaneous generation wasn't true. But all evolutionists, every evolutionist believes in spontaneous generation of life.
This whole evolutionary concept that life came from non-life, it actually violates a law of science. It is one of the only laws in biology. It's called the law of biogenesis. It says that life comes from life, not non-life.
The law of biogenesis that says all life comes from pre-existing life, and yet evolution says that life can come from non-life. Surprise, if you just wait long enough.
But you know what? We see no examples of that today. We can't observe it. We can't repeat it. People just believe it blindly.
Anytime they've done these type of origin of life experiments where they're trying to take a soup, so to speak, of all these different molecules, add a little bit of lightning, and
cook everything together, add a spark, and out comes
tar, they end up with gunk. They have to do a lot of tweaking to end up with
amino acids. That's impressive. Ooh.
It's not even meaningful information as far as DNA is concerned.
Every evolutionary story starts with the Miller-Urey experiment.
The best yields they've ever gotten was 80% L-amino acids and 20% D-amino acids. That would mean that every fifth amino acid in a protein series would be lethal to all forms of life on our planet. The evolutionists tried to get away from this problem of chirality.
The odds for 250 parts coming together, that is 2 times 10 raised to the 476th power. That is going to be a 2 with 476 zeros following after it.
Did you catch that, evolutionist?
The odds for the first cell to come into existence.
The best they've been able to do is the idea that the amino acids assembled themselves on the backs of floating crystals in the ocean. Their schemes and the things they've tried to imagine just don't work.
If you take the cell and you poke a hole in it, you have all the components for the cell, and yet no life.
They'll say, well, that's an origin of life issue, and I'm not going to deal with that. But you have to deal with it, because there's no point in dealing with any of these other things if you cannot even get an organism in the first place.
The problems are exponential. People in the field actually know this, but go with it anyway, because, well, after all, the other disciplines of science are where the real proof is. So the geologists think that the real proof is with the paleontologists. The fossil studiers think the geophysicists have the proof. The geophysicists think it's the astrophysicists that have the proof. Everyone gets to the airport and thinks somebody else brought the tickets.
They would never do this in any other area of their life. They're denying the obvious because of their starting point that there is no God.
Well, a lot of people are enticed by this idea because it takes God out of the picture.
Here's another way in which young people are being conned. When they read their textbooks and it's talking about changes in finches' beaks or changes you see in dogs, the word evolution is used. But then the word evolution is also used for molecules to man. So it's a bait and switch.
Just like all the other sequences, like chimps gradually turning into humans, and this little Bambi-looking thing turning into horses, those kinds of things that have been used for evolution really don't belong in the textbooks. Alan Fiducia, the head of biology at UNC Chapel Hill, says that it will be the paleontological embarrassment of the 20th century, the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs. They're not a related lineage at all.
I get the question of dinosaurs all the time. Consider dragons. We see dragon legends in cultures all over the world. We find petroglyphs, like cave drawings and etchings. And many of these are images of dragons and creatures that we would call dinosaurs today.
The word dinosaur didn't exist until 1841. So before 1841, very often the word dragon would have been used.
Dragon is more of an overarching term. It would include flying reptiles, sea reptiles, as well as things like dinosaurs. Now, when it comes to evidence of dinosaurs and man living at the same time, believe it or not, we actually have an immense amount. When we actually look at ancient histories from various cultures,
we get very detailed descriptions. Those are creatures that today, in our modern world, we would call dinosaurs.
In Genesis, we're told that on day 6, God created the beasts of the earth and everything that creepeth upon the earth. This would, of course, include dinosaurs. In the past, dinosaurs were simply known as dragons. Even as late as the early 1900s, dictionaries described dragons as now rare and a huge serpent. Not only do we find dinosaurs in cave drawings, carvings of figurines, and even in cultural legends from the not-too-distant past, but the Bible speaks descriptively of creatures that sound like dinosaurs. In the book of Job, God tells Job to behold the behemoth, a creature Job would have known. In fact, God specifically says that he made the behemoth along with mankind, and describes it as having a tail that sways like a cedar tree, and bones as strong as iron. He's so big that a raging river is nothing to him. The description of this massive creature fits the huge sauropod dinosaurs we know from the fossil record. The Bible describes in great detail a creature that sounds just like a dinosaur, thousands of years before paleontologists would rediscover and rename them.
My daughter came back from her kindergarten class when she was younger. She brought home a book that said that dinosaurs lived 100 million years ago.
That is just an assertion. They're just saying it. They didn't observe this. You can't repeat this. It is man, fallible, imperfect men who separate man from dinosaurs by somewhere in the neighborhood of about 65 million years now. You either start with what God has to say or you start with what man has to say. God, who has always been there, he's perfect, he's infallible. He's the one who says
The people and dinosaurs walked the earth together.
And a lot of people kind of scoff at that. But you know what? You look back in history, nobody scoffed at that until recent times when people started to buy into this concept of millions and billions of years.
One of the things that really helps to convince people of the millions of years is that chart of the geological column, where you see the rock layers, and then you've got the timeline on the side with the millions of years, and then you've got the bottom-dwelling sea creatures, and then fish and amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs and birds and mammals and people. How did that geological column get developed? It was back in the late 18th and early 19th century. They started to use the fossils, certain fossils called index fossils, to date a rock layer. Oh, well, that rock layer is this old because we know that the rock layers that have those fossils are this old. Well, you might ask, how'd they know how old the fossils were? Good question. They didn't. They were making assumptions about the history of life. That assumption is just invalid.
Remember this? The geologic column. You were probably taught in school that each layer represents a different period of time and was deposited over millions of years. In reality, each layer is simply showing the order of how things were buried. Both land and sea creatures alike are found throughout the geologic column. Sea creatures are found from the lowest to the highest layers, and even on top of mountains. In fact, 75% of the Earth's land surface is made up of sedimentary layers, which are rock layers that are formed in water. Geologists also confess that the world is riddled with massively eroded features, like the Grand Canyon in America, the Blythe River Canyon in South Africa, and the Kapiti Valley in Australia. And yet, they still refuse to acknowledge a worldwide flood. Remember those prophetic verses in Peter? There shall come in the last days scoffers, who are willingly ignorant, that the earth, being overflowed with water, perished. 2,000 years ago, Peter warned us this rejection of truth would happen.
Fossils are actually not the evidence of the history of life. It's the evidence of the death of all life during Noah's flood and how those things got buried. There are sea creatures all the way through the rock record, and we find sea creatures on the tops of all of our highest mountains. There are sea creatures on the tops of the Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, the Rockies. How'd they get up there? Creatures that don't have any hard parts. Fossil worms, fossil animal manure. That's not going to be fossilized slowly over hundreds or thousands of years. Those are some of the biblical and scientific reasons why we shouldn't accept those millions of years.
Well, a lot of people think the biblical chronology couldn't be true because